How does one use the UDL checkpoints to address barriers in the learning environment? For our purposes, for the weekly weigh-in, and for your design of courses and materials, I suggest a three-step process. Step 1 is to consider what the nature of the barrier at hand is. In UDL, we suggest that there are three broad types of barriers. Barriers in how content is represented, in how individuals act or express themselves, or in how individuals engage with the learning or the learning environment. For example, if we look at this barrier, some students struggle with perceiving information in text-only formats, a very real and common barrier. The first thing I would ask is, which of the three domains is this barrier existing within? Well, you might make an argument for how this is either a barrier for how content is represented or how individuals engage with the learning or the learning environment. I think the key word here is perceiving. This is a perception-based problem. Therefore, while it may have an effect in how students engage with the learning, and I'm sure that it will, the first and foremost nature of the barrier is one of how content is represented. Because it best fits with this type of barrier, that's what I'm going to be looking for when I look at the UDL guidelines. Instead of having to scan over all 31 checkpoints, I'm going to focus on those that match the nature of the barrier, in this case, providing multiple means of representation. So for example, I might look at checkpoint 1.3, offer alternatives for visual information, or maybe 2.1, clarify vocabulary and symbols, or 2.5, illustrate through multiple media, or maybe two or all three of these. The next point for me would be to look at each of these checkpoints in more detail to make sure that this checkpoint is actually addressing the barrier as I'm thinking it to. To do so, I suggest going on to udlcenter.org. Let me show you. So here I am at udlcenter.org. I've clicked on the UDL Guidelines 2.0. Here I have all of the principles and the 9 guidelines. If I'm looking, for example, at Principle 1.3 as one that I think might fit this barrier, I can look under Perception to find checkpoint 1.3. When I click on that, it gives me a lot more information that helps me determine if this is the proper checkpoint for addressing this issue. Again, the barrier was that some students struggle with perceiving information in text-only format. I notice here that this does, in offering alternatives for visual information, include text. Though it also includes other things, it provides a special representation of text. And so clearly, this is recognizing that text does provide barriers, and this represents a way to address that barrier. It also gives more information about how we can see examples and resources for addressing that particular barrier. While many of these resources are geared towards K-12, some of them are still very useful in higher education, and it might be useful to take a look at those. So, I now see that probably checkpoint 1.3 is the most appropriate. Once I have that, I'm now able to take a look at the big picture. So I have a barrier. Some students struggle with perceiving information in text-only formats. I have a checkpoint to address this. Offer alternatives for visual information. The next step is for me to figure out how I'm going to apply that in a concrete, specific way for the circumstance. So if I'm working on delivering content via text on Canvas, then maybe I could explicitly teach the use of Read and Write Gold and test it to ensure text-based materials on Canvas pages are readable by Read and Write Gold. This gives the power to the students to use Read and Write Gold to transfer text into audio representation whenever and wherever they want to on the Canvas course and elsewhere. This represents step 3. Determine an actionable, concrete way to apply the checkpoint. Notice how once I identified that representation was the nature of the issue, it's representation that follows all the way through. A representation barrier results in a representation checkpoint and a strategy that changes how things are represented by providing multiple means of representation and giving the students the power to choose, am I going to read, am I going to listen, or both. That flexibility in the hands of the students is definitive of universal design for learning.